Let me show you this a little bit further. Look at Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah is one of those prophets that takes a minute and explains to us how God called him into a prophetic ministry. Isaiah also does that. And Jeremiah chapter 1 tells us, by the inspiration of God through the prophet Jeremiah, how God ordained the process of speaking and writing through the prophets. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 4. The word of the Lord came to me saying, this is God speaking to Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. God didn't look around and look at all the little boys at about 8 years old and see them playing in the yard and going, which one of those guys am I going to appoint to be a prophet? He appointed them before he was even born in the womb. Why? Because God initiates the process. It is so important to him. He selects the individual, builds them, forms them, and then at the proper time reveals himself to them for that prophetic ministry. Why? So that we can know that Jeremiah truly was a prophet and what he said was from God. And then he spoke. Now look at Jeremiah chapter 30. And then after God spoke, Jeremiah said, hey, I better write this down. No. God said, write what I spoke to you down. Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 1. It was not a haphazard process. God selected the prophet, God spoke to the prophet, and then God told the prophet, write it down so that it would always be there for all of my people through all time. Jeremiah 30, verse 1. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Write in a book all the words I have spoken to you. Write in a book all the words I have spoken to you. Somebody says to you, well, how do I know that the Bible is the Word of God? This is how. God appointed the prophets spoke, the prophets wrote those words down. He then spoke to other prophets, they spoke, they said the same thing that the prophet before them said, they wrote it down, the people of Israel held on to that, and then when Jesus came, he went back and said, they said the Word of God, as God had always intended. The prophet spoke, the prophet wrote it down, and then Jesus corroborated it. Look at Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, I love this. One of the things people ask me, if they say, well, Ron, how do you know that the Bible is truly the Word of God? I'll say, well, for one thing, Jesus said it was. Mark chapter 7, verse 9. Now, what Jesus is doing here is one of the things that Jesus did many times is he told the Jews, you have the Word of God, you've read the Word of God, and you've done well to do that, but your mistake is you've added to the Word of God the traditions of men. And when you did, you've twisted or nullified the Word of God by your own traditions. And what he's going to do here, he's going to rebuke them for that. And one of the things that they did was they added to the Old Testament, to what Moses said in Exodus, a little extra rule. And the extra rule said is that you could take some money and you could call it Corban. And when you call it Corban, that means that that money was dedicated to God, and you didn't have to give it away then. And then later, if you wanted to, because they made up the rule, they always had an exception, you could get out of it and take the money back. So when mom and dad were desperate for money and they came to you and you didn't want to give it, you could say, I'm sorry, that's Corban. It's dedicated to God. And then later, you could uncorban it. through a variety of ways. See? And they nullified the commandment of God, and they were selfish. And that's what Jesus says. Now notice, he says in verse 9, Mark 7, and he said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions." Now here he gives a contrast. The commands of God on one side, the traditions of the Pharisees and the Jews that have added the other side. Those are all the laws that have been added on top of the Mosaic law. All the little rules that they added. Now notice here, he's contrasting the commands of God and the traditions of men. Then he says, "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death.'" And now he quotes. He quotes, "Honor your father and mother" from the Ten Commandments from Exodus chapter 20. And then he quotes right out of Exodus. This is a direct quote out of Exodus, the written word. He says Moses said that. Okay? And then he says about anyone who curses father or mother, which comes from Exodus 21. And so he says Moses said these things, and then he says, quotes it right out of the written word. And then he contrasts that. That's the commands of God. And he says, "But you say," Moses said, "you say that if a man says to his father or mother, 'Whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban.' That is, it's a gift devoted to God. Then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify," and he applies, he doesn't say it directly because they knew exactly what he was talking about. He didn't have to. They knew why they were doing that. "Thus you nullify the word of God." See? "By the tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like this." Now I want you to notice a contrast. The commands of God, Moses said, it was written down, it's the word of God. That's one side. The traditions of men, what you say, and then he gives the rule. And what he says is, and this is often, we don't notice it because we're just looking at the application of it, is Moses wrote those things, they're the commands of God, they're the word of God. Exodus 20 and 21 is the word of God. That's right from the mouth of Jesus. How do we know the Old Testament is the word of God? Jesus said so.